Yes, so today I will share some of my research with you about the visual perception of materials and material properties. So when we look at the world around us, we determine not only the identity and location of objects, but also what they are made of. We see what properties they have. For example, we can see that the cloth is deformable and soft, the wood is solid and has a specific texture, and we can estimate the weight of the books or anticipate that the silverware will be cold. Visual estimation of material properties is an integral part of what makes our visual experience so rich. It's multimodal. Only by looking at an object, we know how it would feel to the touch. It's part of the deep understanding that we have of our surrounding world. We can, for example, anticipate how objects are going to respond to an applied force. This is why visual estimation of material properties is crucial for interacting with our environment, because we can anticipate and predict what's going to happen, and we can plan our actions accordingly. So for example, we can adjust the force with which we pick up an object so that it's enough not to lift the object, but not too much to squish it. We can decide on which of these two piles we can place another book. We know how to grasp an object, even if it's very slippery, or how we catch a ball, and how we handle a container with a liquid. And vision is often our first and primary source of information about this. Yet, visual perception of mechanical material properties is a very hard task. So if I show you an image like this one here, and I ask you which color the objects have, then you could look, for example, at the pixel values to figure this out. And similarly, if I ask you about the translucency, you probably look at the distorted images that you see underneath other objects. Or if I ask you about the glossiness, you will attend to the highlights that you see on the objects. But if I now ask you how soft these objects are, put simply, there is no pixel in this image that tells you how soft, elastic, or heavy these objects are. Estimating mechanical material properties goes beyond pure pattern recognition. So the brain must rely on different sources of information. And these images at the bottom reveal more information about the internal properties of the objects shown. And you get an even stronger impression if I add motion to it. So the characteristic ways in which objects fold, fly, deform, or move often tell us about their properties. But this is computationally challenging because the specific behavior depends also on the external forces. So for example, how much this object deforms depends not only on the softness, but also on the weight of the object that's falling onto it. And the brain somehow has to disentangle these different contributions to the observed behavior. So predicting the future behavior of objects then also requires a forward simulation of these estimated parameters. And this is exactly the computational challenge that I'm interested in. How does the brain accomplish this task? And at this point, you might think, this is all nice, but as soon as you showed us this picture, I recognize that these objects are all made of glass, and therefore I know that they're rigid and not soft. And true, much of our perception of material properties might work this way. We recognize materials, and then we have learned to associate these materials with certain properties. And indeed, if we show participants static images like these ones, all showing the same shape, but rendered with different optical material properties, and we ask them to rate the apparent softness, then this increases from left to right in this case. And this is likely in accordance with priors that you have about different material types that you might recognize these objects as. If, however, we now dynamically deform these objects in the same way, and because we use computer graphics, we can do this in exactly the same way for all of the objects, then the perceived softness is the same for all of these three objects. So perception is dominated by these dynamic cues and not by prior expectations you have about materials. And we tested this also with different types of motion, like the one that you see here. And if you're still not convinced, then I can also remove the texture completely and show you that you will still get a sense of the softness, even just with this dynamic information. It's very powerful. And yet, again, the brain somehow has to disentangle the forces applied to these objects and its material properties. And that's exactly what my research is focused on, how the brain solves this problem and how we visually estimate mechanical material properties. And today I want to present a case example to study this phenomenon, and that's elastic bouncing cubes. Here are some examples. And when I say elasticity, what I mean is the coefficient of restitution, like you learn about in high school, so how much energy basically is retained at each bounce. And if you look at these videos here, you probably find it very easy to see that the cliffs on top show objects of lower elasticity and the ones on the bottom are highly elastic. This is almost trivial, right? And if I stop the videos now and overlay the individual frames, I can illustrate that the exact trajectory depends not only on the elasticity, which is the same within each row, but also on other factors. So to create these little videos, I also manipulated where the object starts and whether it has an initial velocity, for example. And so now there is no direct mapping between the visual information that reaches our eyes and the elasticity of the object. And so the key challenge for the brain, and therefore also for any model that we want to develop, is to find the features that vary with elasticity, but factor out all of the other latent variables, such as the initial speed. And in order to study this phenomenon, we had the following approach. We first created a benchmark data set of bouncing cubes that vary in elasticity, but also in other factors. And you see some examples in the background. We use this data set to test human perception and to identify diagnostic visual features that may guide elasticity perception. And we then test these features in more experiments. And so for the remaining part of the talk, I'm going to first briefly describe this data set because that's what all of my experiments are based on. And then I will present a study that's focused on the visual estimation of elasticity in these stimuli, several experiments in which we aim to measure the human accuracy and also tease apart the visual parameters that influence the judgments. And then I will present another study in which we ask whether people can also make predictions about the future states of these objects. Okay. So for this data set, I created 100,000 simulations of bouncing cubes like the ones that you have already seen. And I simulated 4 seconds using the physics simulator of the software RealFlow. And I randomly varied the initial X, Y, and Z position, rotation, and velocity of this cube. So it could start like this, or like this, like this, or 100,000 other ways. And we systematically varied the elasticity of these cubes. So we have 10 latent variables that determine each trajectory, and we're trying to figure out just one of them, elasticity, and ignoring all of the others, basically. So here you can see again some examples just to illustrate the diversity and also show why we used cubes and not spheres, which would be more classic maybe, because they produce more diverse trajectories. Oops. Yeah, in a first step, we want to test how accurate observers can estimate elasticity. And so we selected 150 random simulations, and in an experiment, accidentally stopped this, we showed each animation to observers. They can see the animation as often as they like, and it's just interleaved with this noise pattern, so they know it's starting all over again until they make their estimate and simply adjust the slider to say whether it's elastic or not. And all the experiments I'm talking about look basically like this. Okay, so here I'm going to plot the results of this first experiment, perceived elasticity as a function of the physical elasticity. Here's the average of 15 observers. Each dot corresponds to one simulation, and the color indicates the physical elasticity. And you can make 2 different observations here. The first one is that observers are quite good at this task. As you can see in the upward trend and the high correlation between the two. So the estimates increase systematically with physical elasticity. And the second is that there are differences between the ratings of the same elasticity. So there is no perfect constancy. The ratings are also influenced by some of the other factors that we vary. And another observation that is not shown in this plot, but we measured this separately, is that observers are very, very consistent. So the pattern of errors is systematic across different participants. Okay, so observers are good at this task. And to get more insights into how they do it, we conducted another experiment in which we systematically limited the visual information. So in this experiment, observers either saw full renderings of the scene, as you have seen before, or they saw a version without the background, but sort of the motion of the cube is the same. Or I'm just going to play this again. They saw a version without the cube deforming or rotating. So here the cube is rigidly following the same path with the same speed. Yes, so we had 30 simulations in all these three conditions, and we want to compare whether the ratings are the same or not. And here are the results. As you can see, the three different conditions, I'm not sure whether you can actually differentiate the different colors of the lines, but it doesn't matter because they are basically the same. So the curves are very similar. They have a comparable slope and also comparable patterns. So even this dip here that was driven by one specific stimulation that all observers consistently and in all of these conditions rated as much lower in elasticity than it really is. So it seems that the trajectory alone without all of the background information is enough to judge elasticity. And now the question is, what about this trajectory contains the information? And we propose that humans use 3D motion features to estimate elasticity. These are typical characteristics of the behavior of bouncing objects that depend on elasticity, for example, the number of bounces or the rebound velocity. And these features capture the resemblance across different scenes of the same elasticity, such as the shorter trajectories up here. And they are preserved even though the exact trajectory varies from scene to scene. And I'm going to go through some example motion features to explain you better what I mean with this. So an obvious candidate for a visual feature of elasticity is bounce height. It's very close to the physical concept, the coefficient of restitution, and it has actually been suggested by previous work on elasticity, but they have only used much simpler 1 or 2D motion. And to see whether this plays a role in our experiment, we can now take our simulations, of which we have ground truth data, and look at how the height of one example cube changes over time. And we can determine the bounce heights. That's what you see in red here. And now, because we want to have just one estimate and not, in this case, 6 different ones, we can take the maximum or the mean. We tried both of these and see whether that is a good feature for elasticity. So we did this for all 100,000 stimuli, and then we can see how this feature is distributed across different levels of elasticity. And that's what I'm going to plot here in this histogram. It's actually 10 different histograms, one for each level of elasticity. And the fact that they all overlap tells you that this feature doesn't really differentiate between different levels of elasticity. So in our a little bit more complex and more naturalistic scene, bounce height is not actually very diagnostic for elasticity. The shared variance is only about 6%. So let's look at another feature. A straightforward strategy for observers would be to just sit there and count the number of bounces off the floor. The more elastic the object is, the more often it's going to bounce on average. And we can count the number of bounces for each trajectory. This is represented in the red dots here. And then again, we can do this for all 100,000 and see how this feature is distributed over the larger range of elasticities. And that's what you see here. This is again 10 different histograms with the physical elasticity color coded. And the fact that we see this color gradient from blue to red shows us that the number of bounces really systematically varies with elasticity. And in fact, both variables share almost 80% of the variance. Now, we didn't just come up with 2 features, we came up with a whole list of different features. Some of them capture the characteristics of specific bounce events, others integrate the statistics of the motion over time. And here's the whole list. I don't expect you to start reading all of these. I'm going to go through the important ones during the talk. This is more for completeness. Okay, so we now have 28 different motion features, and all of them are stimulus computable. They're not image computable because we don't intend to also solve depth perception here, but we take this for granted and calculate everything on the underlying 3D data. So they are based on observable quantities, the positions and the changes of position over time. And we make no assumptions in this model of how these features are actually estimated by the visual system. or how noisy these estimates are. They could, here they are based on perfect knowledge of the positions, and in that sense, they are an ideal model. Okay. Because it's a list of 28 different features, we first wanted to test whether, before we test whether observers actually use any of these, we wanted to see whether we can narrow down our hypothesis space a little bit. And we started by asking which of these features are actually good at estimating the physical elasticity. So here I'm going to show how much variance in terms of physical elasticity they can explain. And again, you don't have to read all the labels. I'm going to point out to you the most important ones. So as you can see, this varies quite a lot between features. Some of them, like the movement duration or the number of bounces, or these features that sort of summarize the motion statistics, they seem to be very good, whereas others, for example, the average height of the cube, seem to be useless to estimate elasticity. And we decided to eliminate all features that explain less than 5% of the variance. They just don't seem to be good hypotheses to start with. So we continue with 23 features. And these are complementary in that they measure different aspects of the motion trajectory, but over the whole data set, they are also correlated quite strongly, actually. So what we did next is a principal component analysis with these features. So we calculated all features for all 100,000 and then ran a PCA. And here I'm going to plot in the space of the first two principal components, all of the 100,000 simulation. Each is represented by one dot. And you can see that the first two principal components explain quite a large proportion of the variance already. And in fact, we maybe even only need about 6 principal components to explain the variance. But that's not really what we're interested in, right? The variance in the motion features. What we want to know is the variance in elasticity. And so here I'm color coding each simulation by its elasticity. And as you can see, we get this color gradient along the first principal component from low elastic simulations on this side to highly elastic ones on the other side. And this line here shows how that the explained variance in terms of physical elasticity doesn't increase if we add more principal components. So this single component is enough to explain most of the variance. So a weighted combination, as in this principal component, seems to be a good proxy for elasticity. So I'm going to treat this now as our predictor for elasticity. And we can also show that this predictor is very specific. So here I'm plotting, this is basically the number you have already seen, how much variance this principal component can explain in terms of elasticity. And here I'm plotting it for all of the other latent variables. And it's not that I'm going to animate this plot and the bars will show up. They're already here. They're just so tiny that you cannot see them. So we have identified a combination of motion features that is able to successfully estimate elasticity while ignoring all of the other latent variables. So if the visual system wants to estimate elasticity from 3D motion features, then this combination of features would be very good to use. Yes, so if the visual system wanted to estimate elasticity, then this would be a very good way to do it. And this combination is just emerging from observing the variance in lots and lots of examples. So that's really cool. Now, the key question is, can we actually explain perceived elasticity? And that's what I will show you here. So perception as a function of this multi-feature model. And again, this is just principal component 1. And indeed, we can predict perceived data from experiment 1 very well. And this is impressive. Again, we did not fit the model to perception. We basically just observed the covariance in this large data set. However, to our big surprise, we also found that some of the individual features predict perception as good as the multi-feature model. And here I'm showing the best one, it's movement duration. And this was surprising to us because we were convinced that a combination should be much more robust. And if you want to measure it, you should really use this. On the other hand, if one feature does the job, then in terms of the simplicity, this is the favorable model. And to investigate this further, we looked at the predictivity for each feature. So here I'm plotting how well it can explain the physics. So is this a good predictor to use? And here I'm showing how well it can explain perception. So whether observers actually use this or whether the data is in line with this feature. And so the red dot shows the model. That's basically the data I've already shown you. And this is the best feature, movement duration. And here are all of the features. Again, you don't have to read all the labels. What I want to show here is that there are actually quite a few different features that are good candidates for that can explain the perceptual data. The noise ceiling here shows how well participants can explain each other. So what does this mean now? Do observers use a combination of features, or do they just rely on a single feature? And since the features and the model and the physics are all highly correlated, based on our data, we cannot really differentiate between those. So what we need to do is we need to decouple them systematically. And this is what we did next, and I'm going to walk you through it. So for this next experiment, we simulated another 100,000 stimuli of just one elasticity. So all of them now have the same medium elasticity, and we have decoupled everything from ground truth. So if we now find perceptual differences, then they are all caused by the visual properties of the stimulus, and any model of perception has to be able to explain perceived differences in this data set. And yeah, I'm going to walk you through one example for one feature, how we decouple now the feature also from the model prediction. So here I'm plotting feature prediction against model prediction. And then this area shows the space of all possible features in this data set of just one elasticity. And there is a linear relation between the two. They're highly correlated. However, we now select 10 different stimuli that you see here in the colored dots, for which these two features are essentially, the feature and the model are essentially uncorrelated. So the same stimuli, if I order them according to this order, if the model is true, then it should, the perceived elasticity should increase. Whereas if the feature prediction is better, then it should increase if I order them according to this order. So we showed these 10 stimuli to a new group of subjects and ask them to rate the elasticity. And I'm going to show the results here. First, perceived elasticity as a function of model prediction. And you can see, so this is now not average data, but individual data. That's why it's a bit more noisy. But you can see a clear linear relationship between the two when the correlation is high. Now I'm taking the exact same data and I just shuffle around the order on the x-axis. So that it is in accordance with the feature prediction. And we can see that there is that there is basically no correlation between perceived elasticity and the feature prediction. So for this specific example feature, if it is brought into conflict with the model, then the model does the better job of explaining the data. And we follow the same logic for all 23 features. And I'm not going to show you 23 of these plots. Instead, I'm going to take these correlation values and put them in a new plot. And that's what I'm showing here. So the correlation between models and perception and between features and perception. And everything below the diagonal means that the feature can explain the data better. Everything above the diagonal means that the model can explain the data better. The noise ceiling is again how well observers can explain each other. And the feature that I just showed you falls here coincidentally directly on the noise ceiling. And here are all of the 23 features. If the symbol is white, that means there was no significant difference between these two correlations. So for most features, the model is the better predictor, but there is one feature, and that's movement duration, that can explain the data better than the multi-feature model. And in post-hoc analysis, we also found that the movement duration can explain all of these high correlations as well. So if we factor this out, then this will all drop. So it seems like movement duration wins and is the best predictor for perceptual data. And I'm not gonna show you more data plots. Instead, I want to show you an example. So here we see the same physical elasticity, and what's varying from left to right is the movement duration. And this probably, where's the mouse? makes you perceive them as different in elasticity. And I find this effect quite striking. All of this is basically an illusion because physically they are the same. Now that works pretty well, but we were still puzzled and surprised by this finding that humans should just rely on this one very stupid cue, if I may say so, when a combination seems much more robust. And so we were wondering, what if we removed movement duration? Are people unable to judge elasticity, or are they switching their strategy? And this is what we tested in the next experiment. And this is how our stimuli looked like. So we took the same stimuli as in the first experiment, but we only showed the first second, like you can see here, and then asked participants again to rate the elasticity. And you can judge for yourself whether you are still able to see the differences in elasticity. So here I'm going to plot the results of this experiment, the 1 second ratings as a function of the ratings in the full movies. And as you can see, they correlate almost perfectly. So people are as good as before, even though their most important feature is not available anymore. So they have to use some sort of different strategy. And again, there are several, so this is the same plot as before, now only calculated for 1 second movies. And we see that there are again several different features that could explain the perceptual data. And so now, in order to decouple the different hypotheses from one another, we follow the same logic as before and run a separate experiment to decouple the physics from the features and the features also from the model. And we follow the same logic as before, and I'm not going to walk you through all of the steps again. I'm just directly showing you the end result. So here we found that there were 2 features, but mostly this maximum bounce height that can explain the data better than the model if we bring them directly into conflict. And before, instead of showing you more data plots, I want to convince you with an example instead. So here, again, the physical elasticity is the same, but what's varying is the maximum bounce height. And you probably perceive this one to be much more elastic than the other ones. So yes, when the movement duration is not available as a cue anymore, people seem to flexibly switch to a new strategy. Okay, so now I want to sum up this first part. Visual estimation of elasticity. We found that human observers can accurately estimate elasticity based on visual information from the motion trajectory. We found that many 3D motion features are diagnostic for an object's elasticity. And our results suggest that people use a resource rational strategy. They rely on the single best feature and they can flexibly switch to another one if this information is not available anymore. And this implies that observers represent multiple features simultaneously. Potentially they are derived from a generative physics model. And in order to probe this idea that observers still have sort of an underlying richer physics model, we need to use a different task that cannot be solved with heuristics like this one. And this is what we did in the last experiment that I want to talk to you about today, in which we asked participants to make predictions about the future state of the object. The problem with these features is that they are all correlated with each other. And in order to basically show you these examples, I had to cheat a little bit. So the decorrelation basically only works if I take all of the 10 stimuli. Like if I just randomly pick 3 stimuli out of that set, then some features can still be correlated with each other, but I cannot, like it's very hard to show you 10 at the same time. That's why I picked 3 here. And it might be that in these 3, there are also other features that could explain your percept. But in the experiment, we sort of controlled this better, I would say. But yeah. Let's jump back to the visual prediction task. So we know from other studies that observers can predict the future behavior or states of objects. For example, whether this block tower is going to fall left or right. And in the first part of the talk, I hopefully convinced you that observers are able to visually estimate elasticity, also in these short movie clips of just 1 second. Yet the internal physics model is often reported to be noisy and imperfect. And given bouncing cubes, this is very challenging because even small deviations of individual parameters can drastically alter the trajectory. So here I'm showing the trajectory of a cube that's falling down under gravity from this position and with this orientation. And if I rotate the cube by just 5 degrees around one axis, then I get a different trajectory. And if I keep doing this and rotate it by 5 degrees, I get this whole family of trajectories. This shows that predicting bouncing cubes is very difficult. So we want to know how accurately can observers predict the future path of bouncing cubes, how consistent are they, and how do they solve this task. And so this experiment is now not, doesn't have a slider. This looks a little bit different. So we again show these computer simulations, then the movie stops midway and participants were asked to predict where the cube will bounce and finally land. And in order to do this, they can move the cursor and it moves along the 3D walls, and they simply click on all the bounce locations one after the other, like you see here. And in the experiment, we again began with a short practice for them to get familiar with the setup. And then we show 30 test stimuli, and observers have to predict the future bounce positions. And we repeat these same 30 trials 3 more times during the experiment in order to see how variable the predictions are within individuals. And then in between the test blocks, we had 3 training blocks. The task is the same, but in each block we show a new set of stimuli. And half of the participants get feedback after they make their predictions. So they will see their response together with the end of the movie. And for the other half of the participants, they actually don't notice a difference between test and training trials because it's just the same. And so with this, we want to see whether accuracy can improve with training compared to this control group. So again, whether they learn something or use some strategies they come with into the lab. And then crucially, we also have this last block in which we again show the test stimuli, but instead of asking participants to make predictions, we show them the bounces and ask them to draw what they saw, basically, to get an upper limit of their performance. And because this all sounds maybe a little bit complicated, I made another slide to show the difference between prediction and reconstruction trials, because that's crucial. So on each prediction trial, observers see the first second of the movie, and then they have to predict the rest of the motion trajectory. And it can be between half a second or up to 3 seconds, and they don't know this, of course. And at the end of the experiment, in the reconstruction trial, we use a subset of these stimuli, but we never show the first second. We only show this bit that in the previous trial they had to predict it, but here we show it and they simply have to draw all the bounces that they observed while they did it. So with this, we can measure how a perfect prediction would look like if they were perfectly able to do this, and the only noise is because they are not able to click directly where they intended to or something like this. Okay, so how accurately can observers predict the positions? In this plot, I'm showing the normalized frequency of errors, and the errors are always given in meters. And I forgot to say earlier, but the room is 1 cubic meter in size. And this is the data from the prediction trials. And as you can see, the errors are smaller than can be expected by chance, which you see in gray. However, the errors are larger than when you compare them to this reconstruction trial, in which they could observe the bounces. And in the second plot here, I'm showing again the error, but now how it, the size of the error, depending on which bounce they have, or the number of consecutive bounces that they have to predict. And this increases in the prediction trial. So the errors get larger the further you have to predict into the future. If that makes sense. And this is also shown here. So for the first 5 bounces, I'm showing the full width half maximum distribution of bounces. And now this is all centered. So the true bounce position is centered to 0. And you can see that for prediction trials, the further you have to predict in the future, the larger the error gets. And for reconstruction trials as a control, this is not the case. And we can also see that the errors are directional, so they are larger in depth, which makes sense because we have a 2D projection of the 3D room. Okay, so does accuracy improve with training? To answer this question, we we compared the error in the first block in light green compared to the last block for the training group and for the control group. And what we found is that overall participants get slightly but significantly better over time, but there is no difference between the two groups. So it seems like they use the knowledge or strategies that they have acquired outside the lab, and they probably only get slightly better because they know how to like move the mouse in this 3D world. Okay, so they make some errors. I've already shown you that. Now the question is, are these errors systematic or are they just random noise? So how consistent are observers? This is one example stimulus. It's a difficult one because the cube is now bouncing towards the observer. And in black, I'm showing the true bounce positions connected with a line. And in purple, you see the reconstruction trial of one example participant. And here you see 4 predictions from that same observer collected at different times during the experiment. And as you can see, although this observer predicted the wrong direction, they did so consistently across all repetitions. So this is an example for the high consistency we found within individuals. And now let's look at between individuals. Here's another stimulus example. The black line is again the ground truth, and each line here represents the prediction of one of 40 observers. And participants are not only highly consistent when measured repeatedly, also different observers are very consistent with each other. So the predictions are imperfect, but they're very systematic. And in fact, here I'm going to plot for each stimulus how far the predictions were on average from the ground truth versus how far they were from the average observer. So points below the diagonal mean that the other participants can explain the data better. And points above means that the ground truth can explain the data better. And here is the data. So the other observers can predict data as good as or better than ground truth does. This shows again that the pattern of predictions is very consistent between different participants. Okay, so it seems that they use some sort of simplified model of the physics because they make these systematic errors. And we were wondering whether maybe they mentally simulate a sphere instead of a cube. And we tested this. In order to do this, imagine this is the room. And in black, you see the observed part of the trajectory. And then in blue, you see where the cube moved. So this is the bit of the motion that had to be predicted in the experiment. And now starting from this position where the movie ended, and with the same speed and everything, we simulate the path of a sphere. And this is what you see in red. And now the data, the predictions from our participants, they fall right in between these two predictions. So I did not connect the individual predictions with lines because it was very chaotic, but it's not the case that some of them followed this and the others were here. They're just all over the place. Okay, so we did this for every stimulus. And here I'm going to plot whether it can, the distance of the average distance of the predictions to the prediction of the cube or the sphere. So if the sphere is the better predictor, then everything will fall in this red area. And this is where this example falls. And here are all of the stimuli. And as you can see, the sphere's path does not seem to explain the data any better than or worse than the cube does. So we probably have to include some further constraints, such as noisy estimates of velocity or position in order to better model the responses. But that is still ongoing. And so for today, I'm going to stop and summarize this study. So we found that observers are surprisingly accurate in visually predicting the future bounce locations. The predictions are imperfect, yet they're very systematic, and they probably use an internal simplified physics model. And to bring both of these studies that I talked to you about today together, we found that observers are very accurate and very systematic in visually estimating the elasticity. Their estimates seem to be based on single features, and they can flexibly switch to new features if the information is not available anymore. So this is more an approach of using fast heuristics. Whereas if they have to predict the future path of objects, participants are still very systematic and surprisingly accurate. But here they need to base their answers on a forward simulation, and they probably have a simplified or noisy physics model. And taken together, I think this shows the high flexibility with which the brain solves these different tasks. And it also shows maybe a resource rational strategy in which if you can get away with fast and heuristics, then people maybe choose this cheaper strategy in the case of visual estimation. Whereas if the task requires a more accurate representation and forward simulation, then observers will use this more costly strategy. And there are, of course, a lot of open questions. For example, how the brain switches between these two strategies. We did not explicitly model this here, so I think that's a missing bit. Also, how the brain learns these representations in the first place, and whether our results generalize to other scenes or properties or objects. And then also, what is the neural basis of dynamic material perception? And I could continue with more questions that I have, but for today, I want to thank you for your attention. Thank Roland and Florian and Gießen and Josh here for contributing to this work, and I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to leave you with a summary slide. Yeah.